thank you for being given this opportunity to the Institute that's brought us down here in Young Minds, and thank you to everyone that's come along to this event. It's always a privilege for me, and something that I'm deeply humbled by is the opportunity to share a little bit of my story, or a little bit of the work that I do, and share a little bit of the music, or what I often refer to as the magic, with people in this country, in Australia. For so long, I travelled the world, fortunately. I've played didgeridoo in Buckingham Palace, and I've played 25 shows with Neil Diamond in Las Vegas. But all of that stuff, sure, it's great, it's wonderful. But for me, nothing is more important than being given the opportunity to come home, to come back to Australia, to the country that I love more than any other place in the world, to come back to the place I was born, to come back to the place of my ancestry, and come back and share the history, share the stories with people. Before I go any further, I'm going to follow Uncle Alan. I'm going to make an acknowledgement to country, because like so many of us that are in this room today, with exception to Uncle Alan, I am a visitor to this country. My traditional country is the Gambangia people and the Goko Yaranji people on my father's side, and my mother was a third-generation Anglo-Australian whose family came from Ireland and Scotland. So I'm probably related to half of yous out there as well. One of the big things for me was the embracement of my identity as an Aboriginal Australian. And my grandfather, who was a bushman from the Yaranji people in far northern Queensland, taught me that the only way I could ever understand my identity was to embrace everything about my identity. And I never really understood what he meant until in 2007 I was invited to go to Scotland to play didgeridoo with the Edinburgh Tattoo. And I hate bagpipes, or I did until that time. And I started to play didgeridoo. It was freezing cold. I was in a little red loincloth, and I was all covered in paint, and I had an electric blanket wrapped around me. And I started to play didgeridoo, and I was playing for 30 seconds, and all of a sudden, the sound of 300 pipers lit up behind me. And I began to cry. And it wasn't cold, it wasn't fear, it wasn't sadness, it wasn't happiness, it was just tears. And it was at that very moment that I truly understood, or began to truly understand, who I was. And it was the only way I can ever describe that moment or that feeling is it was the day I felt my DNA dance. It was a true connection to all of who I was as an Australian, as an Aboriginal Australian, and all of my identity. In my grandfather's language, we would say this: "Nanandira nanalinga na yopre na majayilanga na nawang, nagaraga na yora, batira na maure na majayilanga na nawang na dawure, dawure na danga na maure, nadira na yige." Yige na gawure na gawure na maja yilanga na nawure. In our language, it talks about the privilege as a Yaranji person travelling from the far northern Queensland to visit someone else's traditional country and share a song that has been sung on our land for so many thousands of years, but to share it on a land so far away. And share a song through the didgeridoo, what we call the yigi, which was not a traditional instrument to this country. But by us travelling and sharing, that song connected all the pathways and connected our true dreaming. Thank you. Today I have a great privilege, is that I get to travel around Australia, and I still do travel internationally, and I get to share a story about my own personal story. Aboriginal culture has not been part of my life always. Born in Queensland and raised with adopted parents, the culture was very foreign to me. In fact, when I speak with my parents who raised me, I don't actually remember meeting an Aboriginal person until I was 12 years old. I had beautiful parents. My father, who raised me, was Māori. So I was raised with a true connection to what the Māori refer to as mana or tangata whenua, this culture and this old way. My parents raising me believed that if they could give me as much connection to culture, it would help stabilize my life. No amount of love, no amount of care could prepare me for the turmoil that I would walk into in my young teenage life. Between the ages of 13 and 16, I spent more time in juvenile correction than I did outside. The concept of freedom did not exist beyond the concrete walls. And it wasn't until I met my grandfather and grandmother up in Cape York that my grandfather asked me one simple question. And he said, "Son, what do you dream to be?" And at that very point, I asked myself that question, what is a dream? I, in fact, didn't believe that I was entitled to dream. I truly believed that dreams were only for the privileged. And with the notion of that question that my grandfather asked me, I started to ask myself that question, well, what is it that I dream to be? I met my biological father at almost 17 years old through a video link-up on a screen much smaller than that, but he was serving a sentence at Lotus Glen Prison up in northern Queensland. My biological father, became my great inspiration of what I don't want to be. A reflection of a man who I deeply fell in love with as a father, but became a guide to me of there has to be more to life than this. And my father, in the later part of his life, I sat with him and spoke about the world, something that he knew very little about. I spoke about the joy of life, something that unfortunately he hadn't been able to experience. And that's what continues to drive me to share the story of my family and to share the dreams. And I often talk about the ability to dream is like planting seeds. You can plant as many as you like, but if you don't water the seeds, they will never grow. It's the same with our dreams. Only water them, shower them with love, belief, and those dreams grow. Because of that simple dream to take the didgeridoo and share it with the world, it did. I escaped the once impossible concrete walls and have been able to travel the entire world and share stories about my culture, our culture. One of the greatest things my grandfather ever taught me was simply the significance of sharing. That our culture existed in this country for so many thousands of years based on the simple notion that we sat down with one another and we shared. Something that maybe we're not doing enough of today because we take it for granted that we have the means of communication like Facebook and like all the social media networks and email and telephones. I certainly remember a time when no mobile phones, where there were no such thing as a mobile phone. In fact, I remember my dad walking in the house with this massive briefcase and a cord attached to it, and that was his first mobile phone. It was disgraceful. And then they got so small that you lost them all the time, and now they're getting bigger again, that don't fit in your pockets. But we take it for granted. I've got 4 children of my own, from 14 weeks to 10 years old. My 10-year-old knows how to use an iPhone and download apps. In fact, my 5-year-old downloaded so many apps that one day I got a statement on my bill saying I'd been charged $995 because he'd downloaded credits for some game. I was fortunate to be able to notice it quick enough to get that all back. But this is the world we live in, that my nieces that I've raised as well, that I've looked after, I've seen them Facebook each other under the table at dinner time. Why don't you just ask? What are you afraid of? Communication is how our culture has survived for so many thousands of years. My grandfather often spoke about the fact that as Yarrandji people and Nyugul people travelled across our land for so many thousands of years, visitors, and as they came through, we shared with them the stories of importance and significance. And 220 years ago, my grandfather said a new tribe arrived, this time on tall ships. But the sharing stopped. It stopped with the visitors, and it stopped within ourselves. And as a result, a fracture in the dreaming, or what we know as our Yongurra, has happened. And it is up to us to recreate the sharing. And with the recreation of that sharing, we can recreate the remembrance and bring stories back to life. And as I share my story, I share it with you so you can take it and share it with someone else. That is how our culture has survived. It is such a pleasure and such a privilege to stand on stage and share a story, because as I reflect on only just 40 years ago, in this country, up until 1967, Aboriginal people were not even classed as citizens of this land. We were flora and fauna. 40 years ago it is, just over 40 years ago. Horrific things, we know the horrific stories. We're starting to learn about them. Our young children at schools are learning more than what we did. But it is up to us to come together, to sit together, to walk together, to stand together. And we can write our future together. But if we're not brave enough to sit together and speak together and share together, then we will keep trying to write futures individually, and it doesn't work. The only way that we can truly come together as a nation is if we sit together and stand together and share those stories again. The stories that bring smiles, because I've travelled to almost every Aboriginal community in this country. And guess what? What the media writes about the sad stories, I don't remember those because there are too many happy stories along the way. It is the smiles and the laughter that I carry everywhere with me. It is the celebration of life and culture that exists and lives inside of me. And that's what I want to share with everyone else, is that there is so much hope and there is so much happiness in Aboriginal Australia still today. I have a fortunate role that I'm the national spokesperson for Generation 1, which is a national movement to raise awareness to end the disparity or disadvantage between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in one generation, in our generation, through means of education, employment, training, that can really, really make a difference in the lives of people today. So while I stand here representing the Yardinji and the Nyugul people, I certainly stand here asking, as an Australian, that do you want to be part of the generation for change? Because I have a dream, and I know that sounds so cliche, that one day I can sit my grandchildren up on my lap and talk about the sad things that my grandparents lived through, but talk about it in a way that it is something of the past and something that no longer exists. And they can look up at me in complete disbelief that some of those things ever happened. So today, I'm going to close with a piece of music that is on the flute, a Native American flute. I was asked to do a workshop with youth out there that were disengaged, and I knew that I could take a didgeridoo and share a story from my country and it would be interesting to them, but I wanted to remind them of a song that belonged to themselves. And I picked up a flute for the first time and I hated it because it looked like a recorder and I hated the recorder. I was an angry teenager, and that's the dumbest thing to give an angry teenager. But the flute showed me that I could be soft and I could be gentle. And in fact, it came from my daughter. My daughter, I brought home a Native American flute and she picked it up and she wanted me to play it and she began to cry because I said no, and I went, no, I didn't do that. I picked my daughter up and I started to play this flute, this gentle song. And over time, I found someone who made a double flute so I could use the circular breathing that we use as, didgeridoo players. And so the last piece I'm going to play with you is called Kalima. Now, throughout the conference, I'm going to be here. I have a booth, a Generation 1 booth up there with lots of information about what Generation 1 does. I have CDs in the shop and on our booth. I have prints and all those sort of things. But most importantly, I'm there to come and ask a question. Don't be afraid to ask those questions, because that is what I truly love to be able to do, is to be that person that can answer those questions. This piece is called Kalima, and Kalima in our language means the footprints in the sand. And I really named this after, the influence that my eldest daughter was having on my life, as she was teaching me how to be a father for a young girl, wrapping me around her fingers. Thank you. So once again, thank you so much for being given the opportunity to come up and speak as the opening speaker for this wonderful concept and wonderful conference. And the last thing I'd ask you is, do you all want to be part of the Generation for Change? Thank you.